Well, Karl, shall we get started?
Yeah, I think we're ready for that. So, welcome everyone. We definitely have a big topic to cover today. So, I think we're going to start with just a couple of slides. Most of this presentation is going to be very interview and or discussion oriented. Jay and I have prepped some questions for each other. We're really here to talk about shared technology management, and as a lead into that, I guess first we should introduce ourselves. So, Jay, I'll say a few words about you and you can add on anything you'd like to, but Jay and I worked together quite a bit at UC Berkeley, where I was for 4 years and Jay continues to be. He's a social scientist by training, and I became aware of some of his PhD thesis work. And when he came into the organization, it was some really impressive stuff on a data-driven approach to quantifying alumni identity and alumni engagement. Jay and I think, always enjoyed working together, but occasionally we had to come to agreement on some things. And that was part of why I thought, well, this would make an interesting webinar, because this is not a situation where there's just, some quick and easy ways to go that will solve all of your problems. It's as much about the ongoing relationship and how you negotiate with one another as anything.
I agree with that, Karl. It's a nice introduction, and what I would just add is, as we in advancement experience this entire collective trauma of the pandemic, I think you and I met at a critical time when our roles were being redefined. Right. When it was, when there was more pressure on IT professionals to scale and adopt new technology quickly than there has ever been. And then on my side, as a maybe a business lead or a program lead, having to all of a sudden become more well versed in the management of technology. So both of us had something to offer one another. But I will admit that at points in our relationship, it became a little bit of a good cop, bad cop show. But I enjoyed that, Karl, and I love you dearly.
Well, same in return. And it's a pleasure to see you today and to get to tackle this with you. And I should note, just because it was a part of the dynamic, Jay is actually the inaugural Chief Alumni Officer at UC Berkeley. I was his counterpart as the inaugural Chief Technology Officer for Development at UC Berkeley at the same time. And we came in, it was definitely within a year of each other. Maybe I was about 9 months ahead of you, Jay.
That's right.
So I've since left. I am not a redhead, although since I've grown out a beard, some people occasionally think that I shift into that world. Since leaving UC Berkeley, I've been at BWF as the Associate Vice President for Systems and Operations. Ahead of UC Berkeley, I was at University of Oregon Foundation as the Chief Operating Officer. I've also had some stints at University of Washington, Columbia University, Community Hospital of Monterey. And then, of course, my beloved alma mater, the College of William and Mary, where I both went to school and started my career. So a couple of logistics, and then we'll get into it. We'll handle Q&A as much as we can as we go, reserving the right to punt if needed to the end. We are recording this and we'll send a link. And then I don't think I need to point out where the bathrooms are. So I think we're good to dive in. So one of the reasons I think that this becomes a topic that, we've already started to touch on, and I don't know, you're probably not old enough to remember, Jay, but I am. There used to be a time when you would sit around and you would think, boy, it would be great if somebody wrote some software to do this thing. And it didn't exist anywhere. But that is not today's problem. SaaS, it's hard to remember today, but it's actually still a relatively new thing. But software as a service has exploded over the last 10 years, which gives you lower cost of adoption and has eliminated some gatekeeping. We certainly had rising expectations, for the ways that people can interact with all of the institutions in their life. This is a society-wide thing, but universities have to keep up with respect to both donors and alumni. And then, of course, these were existing trends. And, Jay, as you've already mentioned, this really was pushed forward by the pandemic. I think sometimes it's helpful to kind of list out some of the categories and then total up the systems. About 10 years ago, when we talked about engagement and specialized applications and data acquisition, there might be 2 or 3 systems in each of these categories. And now when we look at all of the systems we have to stitch together to accomplish some of these tasks, you know, it's a half dozen or more in each category. And that quickly takes the number of systems that you're working with and how you have to share ownership of them up exponentially. So, you know, question to you, Jay. You certainly had to mobilize quickly at the start of the pandemic. We all did. I think there are some ways, my observation is that you were a little ahead of the game. You know, you were already a data and tech guy. You know, so first of all, I'm wondering, you know, this is really a two-parter for you. How did that early work that you did as part of your thesis and, you know, your training as a social scientist set you up to think about data and systems? And then do you have any standout moments when you kind of realized, hey, if I'm going to be really great at alumni relations, I'm going to have to know how to manage technology?
Well, I'll start by saying that I fell into this alumni relations work. Really, I had gone to school to be a music teacher. And when I was in graduate school, I needed a job. And so I got a job at the alumni office at UCLA. And I was really fortunate to be trained in this business by some of the very best and to start in a very robust advancement and engagement organization. And as I spent 10 years at UCLA, and at the end of those 10 years, I moved to the University of San Francisco. And during that time, I decided to go back to school and get a PhD. And I was wondering about what to study. And there's this question that has always bugged me about our work in advancement. And that is this: why do some alumni give and others do not? And is there even anything a college or university could do about that? Now, the first part of that observation is a qualitative question. You know, why do some alumni give and others not? If you look through the research, I'm talking about the peer-reviewed research on higher education philanthropy, you'll find that the decision to make a gift is a horribly personal one. It's very difficult to predict. The second half of that question, is there even anything that a college or university can do about that? That's a quantitative question. And that's something that can be answered empirically through research. So that is the angle that I took in my dissertation, where I tried to uncover what the factors and characteristics would be of alumni identity. And alumni identity simply means this unique American construct where we carry quite literally on our chest and in our hearts the name of our college or university well past having earned the degree. And, you know, that's a uniquely American thing. We don't see people driving around Melbourne, you know, with their car and the surfboard strapped to the top saying, you know, the University of Melbourne sticker on the back. It's an American thing that we carry forward into our life after college and into our identity. Part of who we are is due to where we went to school. So I started to investigate that. And of course, that led me to the need for technology. Because if we're trying to engage people and deepen their involvement and increase their giving, which I believe is the purpose of alumni relations principally, then we have to be able to do that at scale. And there's no way to do things at scale without technology. And so in as much as I love reunions, volunteer programs, and in-person events, I think the aha moment for me was around April or May of 2020, when I and several of my colleagues, alumni directors across the country, started doing some webinars in the early pandemic, talking about relationship building in the digital space. I was no longer having to convince people that that is what we had to be doing. Even here at Berkeley, starting in December 2019, I was still trying to convince people that engaging the 579,462 living alumni is something we had to do through technology. And I think almost immediately that switched the course of the pandemic. And Karl, that's when you and I started working together and trying to figure out how to do it.
Right. Right. Well, and my observation was, yeah, we had to stop. We didn't have to keep making the argument Also, I think there was a level at which maybe we were, not that there wasn't a lot of work and some scrambling, but we were pretty pleasantly surprised that, oh, well, digital avenues actually already exist for a lot of this stuff, and we just need to more fully capitalize on them. And I think, you know, the trend was already there. The pandemic just kind of pushed us over the cliff that didn't end up maybe being as high or dangerous as we thought it might be. So
I agree with that. So Karl, back to you then. When was the moment when sort of ownership and management of technology began to shift out of just an advancement services thing into sort of a shared thing with the business owners? When did that happen?
Ooh, I think, I mean, I think in some ways it was around the same time. The paradigm shift for me was a little bit, you know, there's a story I tell a lot about, you know, very early days of my career. I think within my first 6 months of my first job at William and Mary, where you know, I got some data to somebody, and it was what they had asked for, but it wasn't what they needed. And my boss had to correct this colleague in a meeting based on something she said out of a report that I had provided. And she came into my office and she gave me a serious talking to, not in an angry way, but just in a, hey, if you want to be good at this business way, you know, and basically her counsel was, look, you know, the work that these fundraisers do and these alumni relations professionals do, it's really hard, and they're putting themselves out there, and you need to understand their business as well as they do if you are going to provide what they actually need instead of what they ask for. And I would say that that was super helpful guidance and set a great course for my career. And I still believe that the core of that is true, that the systems people need to understand as much as they can possibly learn about what their colleagues who are on the front line are doing, to be better at the work. And that saves so much time. I think the thing that shifted for me, though, was, you know, there was an element of, well, all of this system stuff is just too complicated for them to understand in that guidance. And that's the part that has really changed, I think, within the last few years. You know, there was maybe an element of, you know, protect their time because, you know, they shouldn't have to worry about all of this. And there really has been a shift, I think, in the last 10 years, maybe even the last 5, where, you know, it used to be that you would have senior leaders in an organization almost brag about the fact that, well, you know, I just can't understand all of this computer and data stuff. And that has definitely changed. I mean, you look at the really, you know, great chief development officers today, and it's, you know, it's like nobody at UC Berkeley knows the data as well as Julie Hooper. You know, I was also fortunate enough to partner with Mike Andreasen at University of Oregon, and, you know, he was an absolute data head. You look at the chief development officers now, and they're mostly folks who grew up with technology, and it's not like when we used to have to make the case. And so that really shifted my thinking. I no longer think of the data and technology as something I'll worry about all the complexity, you just tell me what you need. It does need to be much more of a partnership approach now. So I think, you know, that takes us then to, well, what does that mean for some of the landscape of our systems, that we have this proliferation, and then we also have this emerging kind of trend and paradigm that needs to shift. You know, well, you know, the basic math that you're dealing with as you manage all of this, whether you're managing it strictly within advancement services or you're taking that step to manage it jointly with your colleagues, you know, you just need to start looking at what does this mean when we have 20, 30, 40 systems that we're stitching together instead of, you know, 5, 10, or a dozen like it was 10, 15 years ago. One of those is, you know, if you have X number of systems and they last, you know, Y years, how many times in a year are you replacing something just to hold steady? And it's not an exaggeration to say a lot of institutions have 30, 40 systems, even if they have a shelf life of 10 years, which is pretty generous in some cases. You know, you're looking at replacing a key component of your ecosystem 4 times a year. I mean, you're constantly in evaluation mode now. And so there are just some implications for systems ownership. Number one is that evaluation, selection, and implementation is now a constant factor of our work. We're always looking at and keeping our eye on new software. This is more than the systems office can handle. Even if we want to be high control, we just can't anymore, especially for understanding all of the business requirements, no matter how well you know the business. This has been significantly shaped by market forces. So this isn't a decision we made and then we started to operate differently. This has been kind of thrust upon us by the world around us. And that means that our organizational structures and processes are still adapting. And, now we're having to think in terms of this complex network of interconnected systems, i.e. an ecosystem. So I'm just going to say then, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So Jay, question to you on this as you look at all of this and we're presenting some of this basic data. You got into this because, you discovered this passion about alumni work. You realize in some ways early on and in some ways your career progresses that your success is going to happen through data and technology. In a given week, how much of your time is spent thinking about systems? And that is a primary way that people interact with you. And then what would you say that you've come to look for in partnership in this area?
Okay, I'm going to throw this out to our audience here. So assuming that that we've got these 40-hour work weeks, which, I know it's not true, but let's just say 40-hour work weeks. As the Chief Alumni Officer at UC Berkeley, how much time do you think I spend thinking about and interacting with systems at UC Berkeley? And let's get some guesses in the chat. And I'm not going to answer until somebody puts it at least
42.
Thanks.
Is that a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy reference, Larissa?
The best way for me to answer that, Karl, is when I'm laying in bed at night or when I wake up in the morning, I'm not thinking about individual alumni events or programs or relationships or donors. I keep thinking about how are we narrowing the focus of what we do to broaden the appeal of philanthropy across such a large segment of people. And that is systems thinking. There's no way to go about this work of engagement without designing some sort of system, whether it's, a waterfall or agile approach. There's got to be a way that you can start with a big number and end up with a narrowed number. Mm-hmm. And as one of my colleagues is fond of saying, and now I've adopted as my own, as part of being an alumni relations professional is learning how to lose and lose early, trying to figure out who among the alumni population are those folks who care deeply about the campus. Maybe they're loyal, maybe they're fans, maybe they have pride, maybe they even have affinity, but they don't identify with the place. And those first four things are all things that you have. Mm-hmm. Affinity, pride, loyalty, being a fan. Those are things that you have. And if you have something, that means you can lose it. But identity is about who you are. So my systems thinking is, how do we find out across our large swath of incredibly smart and capable alumni, how do we find out those for whom being a Cal Golden Bear is a part of their identity? And so I would say that I spent a lot of my time thinking about that as a system broadly. And there's just no way we're going to do that by running committees, volunteer things, event reunions, watch parties, chapters and clubs. It's just not possible.
Okay. Well, we've got guesses coming in ranging from 42, 38. Mark Koenig, who I rarely vote against, is saying 60. I'm going to say, though, I'm just going to go out on a limb, Jay, and if your definition is what you just said, and I'm going to say 100.
Yeah. I mean, I think you and I, as we began to work together and get to know each other, we were testing each other out a little bit. We're both long-term professionals in the advancement space, and both inaugural in our roles at Berkeley. I think you were often testing me about my technology knowledge and wondering if this redhead is really sort of a pseudo technologist. And I was also testing Karl to see, could this IT guy be flexible enough to understand these program outcomes? Right. And I would propose that we got to a point where we knew each other's strengths and weaknesses so that we could approach some really complex problems together and actually achieve solutions that were long-standing and not just temporary. And for me, Karl, that's the best outcome because, as you departed from Berkeley and someday I will too, temporary fixes are part of the problem that we're talking about today that has led to so much technical debt in our world. And I think the fact that you and I were able to accomplish some things that led to some long-term change that would outlive both of us, I think the yours, mine, and ours title of this webinar is about those outcomes. At least I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so. And I appreciate hearing that. I'm glad we got to that place, but let's drill down maybe a little on that journey, because yeah, there were definitely times where I was testing maybe your knowledge, but maybe your knowledge as a proxy for, is this really a thing that you need? Because the list was long, and I don't think we can have this conversation and have it be a true one without, tackling kind of some of that prioritization is a lot of what it comes down to. Technology and data, the team at least, is a shared resource and a finite one. And so let's talk about that. You came in as the chief alumni officer. We start close to the same time. We're both brought in as agents of change. And a big part of what you needed to change was how alumni relations was resourced. What was it and has it been like to make that case for funding, staff time, and especially the need for some of the shared resources?
One of the things I've benefited from here at Berkeley is a leadership from the chancellor on down who really believe in the work of engagement, and that we as one of the top universities in the country, in the world, we've got a great alumni base, but we don't have a great engagement program. And so this is what brought me to Berkeley, was that challenge. I previously had been running my own consulting business, doing this data work around alumni identity. And but I found this opportunity very compelling. So I think when I arrived, it was difficult to prioritize where to start. But of one thing I was certain, that a lot of that prioritization had to be in partnership with advancement services and IT. Because I was not going to hire a bunch of people to do events, or a bunch of people to start up chapters and clubs, or folks who would be, engaged in one-on-one alumni conversations or recruitment. Everything I wanted to do, I knew had to be at scale. And so I think among my laundry list, the first thing on that list was a mentorship program. And that's where the conversation started with you and I, Karl, and the questions. And I think communication is really what we're talking about here, because communication is questions and answers. And some of the questions you asked me about what I really needed reframed what I thought was a point solution into the word you used earlier, which is an ecosystem. And we've been fortunate to take our time over the last 2 years to do a needs assessment and feasibility study, a fit gap analysis of what a single online alumni engagement ecosystem would look like at Berkeley. And now we're at the point, and thanks to some of the wonderful talent on this call, Susie, Marty, Airdrie, we're at the point of being able to issue an RFP for this ecosystem in the beginning of 2023. But I think had I not had a little bit of a push and pull with a technology counterpart, I might have done what a lot of alumni directors do, which is go off and buy a SaaS solution off the shelf for mentorship, slam it into our database, and turn it on and expect the magic to happen. And of course, that's not what happens.
Right.
And so I think your engagement, as challenging as it was, is something that prioritized for me. And if I had to characterize that for the people watching this discussion, I think, Karl, you helped me answer the questions that I wasn't asking in the order that I wasn't asking them. And that is something that I think IT professionals have to get better at, because that's part of the translation table between IT and frontline.
Okay. And I appreciate hearing that. And you know, there were times where I could identify with your frustration. I think in some ways, you know, I would also have to acknowledge there were times when that was a little unfair to you, because there was a lot of stuff that was in place by folks who had been there longer, you know, where they already had existing technology, and because there wasn't as much in place for alumni relations, and it hadn't had as much attention as I think a lot of folks wished it had, you know, you were doing without anything while I was asking you to think more holistically, and there are probably times where that felt a little unfair, and I think was unfair just by virtue of how things played out. So I
wonder which of us had the harder job. You know, well, both being inaugural, so you come in and you've got a robust staff and folks who've got a way of doing things and an organization that was set before you arrived. I came with somewhat of a blank slate, high expectations. You know, those are separate ways of approaching a new job, and right. Yeah, it sometimes it did feel unfair. You know, just to be quite frank, sometimes even the squeaky wheel doesn't get oiled, and you have to find other ways to get things done.
And I do wonder, I mean, I hope you don't mind me sharing about this. I do remember one transformational moment, and we'll not mention too many details, but for me at least, and I think this might be helpful to share with the broader team. And I'm guessing you know where I'm heading with this, but you know, we found that there was a contract signed on campus that involves some alumni data that, you know, we hadn't previously been aware of, and we had to quickly get into problem solving mode. And triage the situation. And if you're on this call and you happen to be a Berkeley alum, there's nothing to worry about here. This all got resolved fairly, even though we can't go into a lot of detail. I think though what happened in that circumstance is we had to swing into action. We had to do it on no notice. We were both angry as all get out about this situation.
That's right.
It was happening over the Christmas break. But what I saw in you in that was new for me was I understood how much you cared about the data and the fact that it was a valuable, irreplaceable organizational resource in a new way. Not that you hadn't ever been that way before, but you cared about the ethics and the integrity of it as much or more as I did. So that was one thing I saw. The other thing I saw, though, was we figured out how to partner in a new way during that kind of potential crisis situation. And, you know, you swung into action as the communicator and the person who was managing up and the guy who was tracking all the details. And then you left me free to analyze the heck out of this contract and see where we had wiggle room, what we could maybe gain some ground on. And it illustrated for me, it's like, wow, we really have some complementary strengths. And when we're figuring out what the goal is and pulling together towards it, we made some amazing progress, and that really shifted some things for me in a way that was helpful. And I think then when I brought that back to our broader relationship, it helped me start to think, okay, well, what is the end goal? And maybe how do we think less in terms of prioritization and protecting existing resources, and more in terms of what you're having to do with your program, which is let's grow the technology pie along with yours and maybe take a new approach. So I'm wondering, I mean, I think that breakthrough moment probably resonates for you, but was there another or anything else you'd want to share on that?
It does, and I think this is an absolute illustration of what I was leading with at the beginning of this call, talking about the time that we found ourselves in over the course of the pandemic, which was a time of economic constraint, at which Karl and I found out right before the Christmas break that the university had essentially sold alumni data to a third party without the knowledge of the alumni office or the development office. Now, That might sound strange, but we work in very complex organizations that are incredibly distributed. And the best thing that came out of Karl and I having sort of a clear vision about ownership and stewardship of this data is once we resolved that process, it was made clear to the campus and enshrined in policy that university development and alumni relations is the data steward for alumni and donor data. And so that this could never happen again. And that actually cascaded across the campus, Karl, after you left, where the policy began to be expanded to say, this unit is the steward of student data. This unit is the steward of parent data. This unit is the steward of health data. And that landscape, which was very uncertain prior to the pandemic, for better or for worse, is now in a place where we can have a greater sense of trust. And I think, if nothing else for me, that built some trust between you and I. And I also think it built some trust between the two of us and our campus partners, who saw us standing up and fighting for something that we thought was critical. And whereas the people who had gone about this work that we thought was unethical had never really thought about it that way. And so it gave us a chance to drive a stake in the ground, maybe, is in the cartoons when you see they're building their railroad and one guy strikes and then the other guy strikes, and then we were working together in rhythm. And I think that that carried us forward into what you started to talk about there, which is we stopped thinking about being competitive. How can I protect what I want or the resources that I have? And you and I started thinking about, and often over pupusas across the street, how can we grow?
I miss those.
Yeah, how can we grow the pie? How can we grow our resources? And an example of how that has worked for me is I was in a place at the end of last fiscal year of really needing some data analytics resources. And I had the position, I had the position ready to hire in my office. I was going to hire an analyst. And I went to Karl and I went to the head of our reporting team. And I said, here's what I want to do, but I don't know if this is the best thing. I might hire somebody who's going to work in isolation, who may do the work that I need, but that may not be as strong as my supporting Karl and my counterpart in hiring additional resources on our existing information strategy and analytics team. And so we chose the latter, and that has benefited me because that team has been able to hire more people who do not work in isolation, who work among a cohort of data analysts and report writers. And so now the entire office has more resources, but I also have those resources too. And so, that's you were asking me about how I'm growing the office. I think that's also an opportunity for those of you on this webinar who manage technology resources and who see frontline alumni relations or gift officers creating their own analytics resources within their teams. It's an opportunity to maybe create a bridge.
Yeah, and that answer might change based on your institution, of course, and what's already in place and what are the gaps that you're trying to cover. I think the advantage of at that time going the way that we did was, you didn't have a single point of failure. You didn't have to find all the skill sets in one person. You could get an FTE equivalent, and if something was a dashboard, then that might have one person doing the work for you. If something was some other kind of reporting work, it might be another, and then that person had the support of a team. I think maybe another thing to pick apart or highlight in what you just said, Jay, was going back to the governance issues around data around campus. One thing to maybe mention to folks who are listening in on the call. My position at the time was really an interesting one in that I had a hardline reporting relationship within university development, but I had a dotted line reporting relationship to the campus CIO. And so when a situation came up where it was like, hey, this thing has happened with our data and it's highlighted a lack of governance, there was support for that more broadly within campus, but then there was also support to carry that forward and say, well, actually, we figured out data ownership for development, but do we have that spelled out across our system? So I'm really delighted to hear that that has continued, and that broader governance discussion is happening across campus. So let's see, we've got actually a couple of questions that have come in, and then I've got a few more slides to get to. Let's see, Karl, how do you teach the Q&A translation skills to IT staff? And that's from Larissa. So Larissa, I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, I mean, there are a few practical things that you can do. One thing I did at Berkeley that was incredibly valuable is once a month I would host kind of a lunchtime session for the advancement services team that basically I would bring in a colleague. So I'd bring in the director of planned giving, or I'd bring in the VP of development, or I'd bring in the director of annual giving. Jay, you were a guest for us one time. And I would just interview them for an hour in front of my team, talking about, hey, what is your work like? What are some of your goals for the year? How did you get involved in this line of work? What makes you passionate about it? What are some of your big systems needs? Over time, that kind of became a short course for my team in terms of, well, how does this office operate? And how do these different teams depend on each other? What are the functions that they cover? Which was really well received, I think, on both sides. I think the folks who came in, loved having a chance to talk to the systems team, and the systems team loved having, the chance to hear directly from some of their fellow practitioners who they might not ever work with directly otherwise. I think maybe more important, though, than practical steps, one thing I just look for in hiring especially is curiosity. It's qualities that you can't teach, but you can capitalize on if they're there. And, you have to find people who are curious. You have to find people who are driven by fascination with the technology, but also by a desire to make a difference. Because, we don't pay as well as industry. People have to have different motivators than just the paycheck and just getting to work with the latest whiz-bang stuff, because we don't always get to do either of those. Although that's changing, fortunately. At least on the whiz-bang stuff, maybe not on the salaries. And then, you have to find people who really have that communication skill as much as they have some technical acumen, and that's the primary motivator. And I would actually rather hire somebody who's a little more relational, a little more curious, a little more interesting, and augment their technical skill set than vice versa. So that's at least my paradigm there, in response to your question, Larissa. Jay, we've also got a question. I hope I'm going to pronounce this correctly. Muzafurin. Jay, how did you get a buy-in to move the Alumni Identity Project forward?
Well, I've done 9 of these alumni identity projects now at various colleges and universities across the country. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I will drop in a few links in the chat, including a quick survey that you can take to test your own alumni identity and see where you end up. Making the case for large-scale projects, especially if they're new in higher education, is really hard. But I think an example of how we're starting to address that here at Berkeley is we've built for ourselves a really now well-connected community of alumni engagement professionals across the campus. And this has happened because of technology. We now meet every other month for a workshop, and it's about 150 people who work in alumni relations in some capacity across the 14 schools and colleges. And we typically bring in an outside expert or someone internal to give some insight to this large population that's distributed, but yet working with the same alumni and donor base. So creating buy-in is much more about consistency than it is creativity, in my experience. And by consistently offering something of value to this larger group of professionals, and really giving them a space to call their own. As we approach a large-scale alumni census at some point here as we end our campaign, we will already have those folks engaged in understanding the value of updated donor information and updated alumni interests and parameters around alumni identity as well. So this is going to vary from school to school, and it's always hard to get something new off the ground. But I have found, again, that consistency trumps creativity when it comes to something new. And as much as we want to present a new idea as exciting and energizing and come up with a logo and a great slide deck, maybe just quietly talking about it to people consistently over time and bringing value to their work by creating community, that gives you the platform to launch something new. And I'm really hopeful that that's helpful advice for you all as you think about the things that you've wanted to do. And now that the pandemic is slowly coming to a close, maybe you'll have the bandwidth to attempt. So great question, Musa. Thank you.
Yeah, and actually, Jay, if you don't mind me adding to that, a few things I'd reflect that I saw Jay do. You know, he was willing to play the long game, and just think in terms of, okay, what's the actual true thing that I'm trying to accomplish in the long term. And I think what's valuable about that is then a lot of conversations about, hey, wouldn't it be great if? And can you envision a world in which this is how things work? And, you know, quiet conversations happening on a spaced basis over time kind of starts to yield this consensus of, well, yeah, we really would like to get there. And you know, that really, I think, got people on the same page about the end goal. And then I think, you know, you've also been very willing to invest time in being realistic about resources that, okay, well, if we really want to get there, this is what it's going to take. And we should really look at that and look at how big it's going to be. You know, how do we size that? How do we really account for what it will take? Because we don't want to go in not having fully considered the cost. And I think, you know, once we kind of started to think in terms of growing the pie and you know, taking that approach jointly, you were all in. And I'm thinking specifically about the plans at Berkeley to build, you know, comprehensive alumni engagement when I'm talking about this. But I saw those as two very important factors in you know, kind of the ongoing way that has evolved.
Yeah, you're right, Karl. Engagement is a long-term play. There's nothing about it that can be forcibly immediate. I mean, as those of you who've been involved in annual giving in the past, you know, you can always increase donors and cash in a single year. There are many ways to do that, but it's very difficult to sustain that over time if you burn through donors. And so engagement is that long-term strategy. And for those on the call who I've had the pleasure of working with or consulting with in the past, I know we're all disciples of that view.
Well, that is a helpful segue because I'm going to shift back to the slide and you know, thinking in terms of you know, long-term strategy in terms of engagement. You know, this is what I would say is maybe the long-term strategy in terms of systems, broadly speaking. No matter who you are, some of what I would posit out of these trends that we've observed and we're discussing and that have us, you know, thinking about shared management, I think we're after sustainable ecosystems. So, you know, we've backed into having all of this stuff, and now we're figuring out sometimes retroactively how to pay for it and how to get out of debt and how to share management of it. But we want to keep all of this. I mean, this isn't necessarily a bad place we've gotten to. It's just maybe a little unsustainable the way we backed into it. We just need to acknowledge the fact, though, we're running 3 to 5 times as many systems with teams that have increased. If they've increased at all, it's been incrementally. We certainly don't have 5 times as many staff. And that all of these, you know, have interdependencies, you know, terms and conditions, implementations, upgrades, expected lifespans. And so part of what, you know, we've already been discussing and touching on this a little, but part of what we need to think about is with our teams and structures and how do they adapt. And I would posit, one thing we've already been touching on, well, all managers are now technology and data managers to some extent. Just like all managers need to understand finance well enough to do a budget and HR well enough to make hires and manage their teams, technology and data management does become a component, I think, of all management. And also that our organizational alignment can't just be top down, because there will always be times where the big priority doesn't reflect all the priorities or all the work that needs to happen. And so I say that there are some ways that I think about systems team adaptation, at least, that provide some points on here. The difference is when you're running 10 to 15 systems versus 30 to 50 systems, the things that you're doing and the skill sets you're looking for just change. And this gets back a little bit to the question we were asked a little bit earlier. You're thinking less about how you administer the systems and more about how you implement them. You're thinking less about planning your software and developing your own than you are about evaluating what's already out there. You're thinking less about hardcore, low-level programming and much more about programming on platforms like Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics. You're not developing your own applications for unmet needs as much as you are finding them and then having to administer them. You're not thinking in terms of, deep influence with 2 or 3 key vendors as much as managing, the dozens of vendors that you're working with. And then you're thinking less in terms of, learning all this stuff internally as you are managing all the knowledge you have access to. And you're less technically oriented in terms of deep depth in particular areas. And then you're more looking for tech generalists who understand the business. So Jay, those are some of the ways that I think about the technology team needing to adapt. I guess I'm curious, what are some ways you think about your team differently? And you've touched on a few already, but given that so much of what they're doing is around technology and data, what are you looking for with some of your hiring and some of your position creation?
I'm also looking for generalists, Karl. And I think that's a shift within the alumni engagement realm and even frontline fundraising as well. So much of our work leading up to maybe the turn of the century was really focused on traditional ways of engaging folks and led to a deep specialization in having your reunions manager and your chapters and clubs manager and your communications person and your volunteer coordinator and your events person. And then, of course, if any one of those people left, then you were left in a lurch. So with the opportunity to grow my team from the ground up, I have sought to create generalists among all of our hires. And what that means is that people understand the intersection of the 3 principal ways we engage people, which is volunteering, events, and marketing communications. And then spliced within that, how does technology fit? So volunteering might be an in-person or an online endeavor, but either way, if we want alumni to be able to volunteer on their own, we need to remove the staff gatekeeper, and technology is required to do that. Events can be online or in person, but if we want people to be able to attend those events, they have to be able to interact with technology instead of RSVPing to an email address. And then how about marketing communications? In as much as we rely on email and sending things out and pushing out our messages, what about marketing? That's just comms. Sending people things is just comms. And I think that's sometimes often confused. Marketing is the creative part. Communications is the consistency. Marketing is the creative part. And so among all of the folks who are on my team, creative ways to use technology to scale marketing to get the message out about events, volunteering, and programs. So I'm looking for generalists too, Karl. And I'm fortunate, again, to have come into this business in a way that a generalist knowledge set was valued. I think that's much more challenging, actually, for what you do, and especially for staff who have long tenures at organizations who may have really been focused on one developing, one program language or one system.
Right.
I think it's harder for you, maybe. So I'm going to give you more credit there.
Maybe, although some of those folks who have been dedicated to one product are very eager to get off of it, and also, have some surprising insight into the history of the business if you take the time to ask them. So there's both a pro and a con there.
Anyone who wants to be an Aleutian Advanced, for the rest of their career, I would question their sanity.
Yeah, it's still surprisingly valuable, but won't be for long, I think.
Yeah.
So at least the legacy product, they've got a new one that continues to sell. So so a few more questions, and we're getting close to the end of our time. So Larissa, yes on knowledge management. Are any institutions using a knowledge management system, and with staff turnover high, how are you maintaining institutional knowledge? Yeah, the closest I'm aware of, to be honest, is I see knowledge management starting to come in as people are managing big projects. So they're, bringing in some systems like Conga, or even Slack, as ways to do quick communication and start to archive materials. I'm a little uncomfortable with products that are maybe third-party cloud products there, because I'm not sure you want those valuable materials outside of your control to that extent. But I think people are also making use of things like Microsoft Teams to an increasing degree, and that can maybe be a little more contractually under your control, with some guarantees on life cycle that you might not have with some more casually adoptable products. Not that Slack and Conga aren't excellent, but they're just a different level of guarantees that you can get with some of the enterprise products that come through things like Microsoft. But to me, I think this is an area that everyone wants to get to, and I have a harder time knowing what's really excellent here. I know at Berkeley, we tried some things with wikis and some other things that could be successful within the technology team. I think it was a little harder than to share that out broadly in ways that were helpful. Jay, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think we all kind of, excuse me, do this in our own way, but business intelligence documentation is woefully lacking in our business. I'm not sure how to address that, except that it's much easier to transition when you hire new employees now, as we have the documentation in things like Google Drive or in shared drives or in Box or something like that. But ultimately, I'm less interested in maybe how we get better at documenting things, and I'm more interested about how we get people to think differently long term. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of how I would answer your question, Musa, in the chat about how do you measure engagement through marketing communications. Is it open rates and click rates? Yeah, sure, but when you look at an open rate and a click rate, you're just really counting something. It doesn't tell you much beyond that. I'm terribly interested in what are people clicking on and what are they opening. And we do a pretty poor job of storing that information and leveraging that information. So Matt, let me put it this way. What if Target only tracked how many things you bought and how many times you went into their store? So your open rate and your click rate. They don't do that. They track exactly what you bought. They track when you go into their store and when you're not there. So they know much more about you than we know about our alumni if we just stop by looking at click rates and open rates. I hope that resonates with people.
All right, we're pretty close to the end. Just want to check real quick, any other final Q&A? If there's not, there is one thing I feel like it's really incumbent on us to mention, which is we should talk about Drive.
Good.
March 28th and 29th, 2023. It's in Chicago this year. And who's the chair of that this year, Jay?
The redhead on your screen. And I'm the very first time Drive has ever had a chair from somebody who's not been in advancement services. And I am taking that mantle as seriously as I can. Drive is a conference that I love. I have come out to all of you as a data nerd and a Star Trek fan. But I hope you will join us at Drive in Chicago. Chicago is a great city. It's easy to get to. Even in March, the weather won't be that bad. Come on now. But we're really excited about the theme for this year. And the theme for Drive this year is collaboration thrives at the data layer. And the postscript there is that, you might have collaboration as a word in your strategic plan. It might even be a line item in your budget. But unless there's two-way engagement at the data level, collaboration just doesn't happen. So I hope you'll think about joining us. We had over 90 sessions submitted for Drive this year.
Nice.
We've accepted 30 of them. Wow. They are tremendous. And just a bit of a teaser, the registration for Drive is open officially as of this morning. I'll put the link into the chat. We have two wonderful bookend keynotes. At the very beginning, we are going to have a keynote from some of the performers of Second City in Chicago.
Nice.
We're going to come and tell us all about what collaboration has to do with improv comedy and how we can bring those lessons into our work as it relates to data. And then the closing bookend is a wonderful presentation by an incredible African-American female leader in the data space who's going to walk us through the 30 amazing women who've changed the data landscape. And it's going to be very inspiring. So whether you come for the improv comedy or understanding the legacy of women in a traditionally male-dominated space, or maybe just the vendor presentations in between, I hope that you will join us in Chicago.
Great. All right. So, well, thanks to everyone. Thanks for that, Jay. And yeah, it sounds like it's going to be tremendous this year. And I think you're bringing, a valuable new viewpoint to what some of the content will be. So that's going to be fantastic. Thanks to everyone for your time today. We know it's valuable. We know you've got way too many things to do in too little time. So really appreciate you trusting us with an hour. We've got a QR code that you can scan, and then we've also got a link in the chat. We'd love to hear your feedback. We're always trying to steer this content to make it ever more useful. And I think with that, we will say goodbye. And Jay, thank you for your time today and for collaborating on this with me, collaborating with me once again on this in particular.
It was great to have this conversation with you, Karl, and for everyone who's been able to join us today or perhaps watching this recording, the very best and happiest of holidays and Merry Christmas.
Great. Take care, everyone.